Welcome back to Beyond Four Walls, Conversations on Affordable Housing. I'm David Dworkin, President and CEO of the National Housing Conference, the nation's oldest and broadest affordable housing coalition. I'm joined today by Benson Buzz Roberts, who has spent over 45 years working in affordable housing and community development before retiring last December as President and CEO of the National Association of Affordable Housing Lenders. Over the course of his career, Buzz has played a leading role in the creation and improvement of groundbreaking policies such as the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, the New Markets Tax Credit, Home Investment Partnership Block Grants, the Capital Magnet Fund, Treasury Department funding for FHA multifamily risk-sharing loans, regulatory changes to the Community Reinvestment Act, and the proposed Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, a veritable zealot of affordable housing. Buzz continues to serve as a board member of several national and local nonprofit organizations and coalitions and has written extensively about affordable housing and neighborhood revitalization. Before joining NAHL, Buzz served on the Biden-Harris Transitions Agency Review Team for the Treasury Department. He was the director of the Office of Small Business, Community Development, and Housing Policy at the Treasury Department, and previously Senior Vice President for Policy and Program Development at the Local Initiative Support Corporation, LISC, a leading nonprofit investor in low-income community development. Welcome, Buzz. I'm so excited to talk with you today.
It's great to see you, David.
Well, thank you. I think that no one's bio really captures the breadth of their career. That is particularly true in your case. And when I think about all the different things that you've been involved in, you're kind of the zealot of housing. I mean, it really, you go back to the 86 Tax Act, which I think easily half the people listening to this may not have been born in 1986. Sad for both of us, but true. It beats the alternative, I guess. But, you know, they say victory has 1,000 fathers and defeat is an orphan. So there's plenty of fathers of the low-income housing tax credit, but you're certainly one of them. And work our way through every major housing policy since then. And you've been involved in it in one way or another. So I definitely feel like, you know, you're a walking history book for us. And we can talk about some of that. And really quite a career, quite an impact. It must feel great.
It does. You know, I worked hard for a long time. And so now I'm ready to kick back a little bit.
Just a little bit. I have a feeling that you'll get dragged into things on a pretty regular basis, much to your chagrin or Kathy's.
Yeah.
It happens.
We'll see.
Let's start at the beginning. I mean, how did you get into housing coming out of college? What brought you to LISC and what made housing so appealing for you?
Well, I've always been interested in issues of wealth and poverty and of neighborhoods. So actually, even before I graduated from college, I took a year off and was a community organizer in Virginia and North Carolina, which taught me a lot. It taught me that I didn't want to be a community organizer for the rest of my life.
Yeah, you and Barack Obama.
And it also taught me that really finance and capital and access to credit were fundamental to the future stability of neighborhoods. And so I decided to focus more on that. So I got to LISC after having been a consultant to LISC for a number of years and putting together programs and deals. And LISC was, of course, at the time and still really a leading investor in revitalizing communities. So that was a great fit for me. 1988.
In 88. And before then, you were working how? Give me a sense of...
When I got out of college, I came down here, went to work for a trade association of nonprofit community development corporations. And when I felt like I was really talking out of my hat a little bit too much, decided I would really be better off learning how the business really works. And so I went to work for a consulting firm, and our clients were a combination of foundations, nonprofits, some for-profits, some state and local governments, all trying to get this work done at a time when there weren't a lot of resources to do it.
So walk me through the early concept of the low-income housing tax credit and the 1986 tax bill, because prior to that, there was a whole different way of financing government-supported housing, and that was going to get wiped out in the tax bill. And so obviously a big question around now what?
Right. So the ground had been laid for that back in 1981 when Congress decided to really terminate new commitments for the then standing programs, mostly HUD programs, to build affordable housing. And at the time, that main program was Section 8. And Section 8 then was very much a project-based subsidy system. So when that ended, folks at the ground level who were still compelled to address these issues started finding other ways to do it. At LISC, we had pioneered use of some tax incentives for rehabilitation to get that done in Chicago, and were able to attract corporate investors for that effort. And so when tax reform started coming around and we saw threats to even that resource, LISC asked the firm I was working for to help address that. And so we went up to Congress to talk to them about this. I must say that the reception was extremely negative at first, because the reputation of those pre-existing tax incentives was so poor. I remember talking to staff on the House, and they were saying, oh yeah, low-income housing, that you mean 20% for 20 minutes. And we agreed that the pre-existing incentives were too weak, both as a matter of accountability, but also in terms of their impact. And so the low-income housing tax credit made a lot more sense because it's more credit-based rather than deduction-based. So at a moment when you were cutting the corporate tax rate and the individual tax rate way back, deductions had less cash value than they had before, but a credit is a direct offset against tax liability. So it'd be much more powerful. And as a result, we could deliver a lot more public benefit for the public's tax expenditures.
And it has to remain affordable for the entire period of time you're getting the credit.
That's right.
Hence the 20% for 20 minutes concern.
That's right. You only get credits on the housing that actually serves low-income people. And the housing has to serve them for at least 30 years, and in many cases, a lot longer than that.
And so how do you sell something like that? It's complicated. It's carrying a lot of baggage. You've got a very dynamic political situation on the ground. Reagan's second term, really the first half of his second term. So you're making this case in Morning in America. How did you guys do that? How do you put together a coalition around that?
Well, at the time, it was a fairly limited coalition, because the incumbent industry felt that tax reform was basically a death sentence and they were going to get out of the business anyway. And they didn't believe in these tax credits, especially without Section 8 subsidies to back them. They didn't really believe that affordable housing could succeed in the private market, that you could build this on time and on budget, that you could operate it in the black, that you could maintain the housing at a high level, and that investors would actually get their money back. So we had to really recreate a delivery system to do it. Politically, we had the good fortune of an opening with the Senate Finance Committee at the time, and the chairman of which was Bob Packwood, a Republican from Oregon. And they were open to the idea. And then we got Senator George Mitchell, who is the Democrat from Maine, interested in trying to come up with something else. And we put all that together into a much better targeted and much more powerful low-income housing tax credit.
But at the same time, your industry, normally a close ally in an endeavor like this, pretty lukewarm.
Pretty lukewarm. I remember we had been having these discussions with the industry for month after month, pretty much at loggerheads. And then when it became clear that the status quo was simply unsustainable in the face of very wide-ranging tax reform, I remember going into one of those, I think they were weekly meetings at a law firm, and one of their leaders walked in and he said, "I've seen the light. Let's work together." From that point on, we did work very closely together.
So you skip ahead to passage, enactment. President signs the tax bill. Now what? You're the dog that caught the car. You've got a tax credit with no market.
Right. So at the time, it was really just LISC, Local Initiative Support Corporation, for whom I was consulting at that time, and the Enterprise Foundation, now Enterprise Community Investments, that were really leading the charge to remake a delivery system. There's a lot of skepticism. Initially, we were able to get some corporate investors together. The rates of return they were requiring were really high, above 20% rates of return. It's really a pioneer investment. Some of those investors told us they didn't really believe this was an investment. They really thought of it more as a grant to LISC, an organization they knew and liked and trusted and wanted to help out on this kind of mercurial adventure. But they didn't expect to get their money back. And of course, the idea that nonprofit community organizations operating in the toughest neighborhoods in America, serving the lowest income people in those communities and in the country, could pull this off and deliver high quality housing that would be well maintained and deliver on the promises we had made to our investors seemed aggressive, but we knew we could pull it off. And rather to say, we knew that the communities could pull it off, and we did.
And yet, you put this thing in place, you start to see traction. What does that look like? How do you build a market like that?
Well, I think probably a lot of the more sophisticated, deeper pocketed folks in multifamily housing took a look at what these ragtag groups were able to achieve and decided, well, if they could do it, maybe others could do it too. And investors started to see that this wasn't really a grant in the clothing of an investment, but a real investment that was generating better returns at lower risk than a lot of other things they were doing. Started to turn the market around. And then we started to see much more reasonable rates of return. Rates of return started plummeting, and they're now down around 5 or 6%, which is crazy. Cheaper than you can get a mortgage.
So quite a success story. I mean, today, LIHTC is the most effective producer of low-income housing in the country by a long shot.
By a long shot, and I think it's by...
How many units are we talking about here?
Almost 4 million and counting.
Yeah.
And I think it's widely agreed that this is the most successful affordable housing production program in American history, certainly the longest lasting. I mean, at the time the credit was enacted, it was axiomatic that affordable housing production programs last for only 7 years, and then because of fatal flaws or market changes or political winds shifting, they go away. Low-income housing credit has been around now for 38 years.
You seem to have gotten the fatal flaw part wrong. There wasn't one.
Right. Well, I think that one of the things about the credit, obviously in 1986, we had an idea of how this was going to work, but we weren't clairvoyant. What we did do right, though, was we did have a nice dose of humility. We didn't try to over-specify the program. We just focused on the core public benefits and provided us so much flexibility as to allow the market to evolve and to refine. And the market keeps refining year after year. And I think that's one of the secrets to the longevity and continued productivity and confidence that the credit has brought forth.
So today, we look at the low-income housing tax credit, nearly 4 million units, and we have this really devastating shortage of affordable housing nonetheless for a wide range of reasons. But one of the proposals on the table in both the president's Housing Supply Action Plan and I think indirectly in the Republican platform as well is using tax credits to create more affordable housing. What does that look like? How do we do that? Tell me a little bit about the effort today to make LIHTC better.
So there are lots of little technical tweaks that we would like to see. We're always looking to make the credit work better and be more responsive to local needs. But the core program works very well. And so expanding it would be a very simple mechanism. Congress simply says, hey, the states have more resources to work with here. And there's already a delivery system in place. There are already investors in place. There are lots of people who would take that additional opportunity and run with it and produce great housing in a wide range of communities.
And so there's legislation on the table now, the Affordable Housing Credit Improvement Act. Pretty strong bipartisan support for that.
More than half the House, evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans, is formally sponsoring the expansion of the housing credit. And in the Senate, also a very strong bipartisan group of senators have declared in favor of this.
And 200,000 units of that already approved in a tax bill overwhelmingly passed by the House earlier this year. And yet,
well, I mean, this is the nature of our political system. You have to have a tax bill that's broad enough to include something like affordable housing in order to move forward. And we didn't have the momentum to do that broader tax legislation this year. Next year, however, a wide range of incentives put in place temporarily in 2017 during former President Trump's administration will expire. And so there's going to be a lot of pressure on Congress to address with those expirations, decide which of them to continue and which perhaps to let expire. And that creates an opportunity to get more resources for the credit. And I'm very optimistic that will happen.
I think I am too. And it's never on my timetable, but we seem to be moving closer and closer to that moment where the momentum for really dealing with affordable housing is strong enough to get us over the finish line, because more and more communities are struggling with this. And it is certainly not a blue state, blue community issue by any stretch of the imagination today.
No, I mean, I think it's unfortunate that housing affordability is so problematic for so many people. But as we say, never let a good crisis go to waste.
As we say. So LIHTC, big success. Next on the board, I think, New Markets Tax Credit, another successful tax credit program, been involved in some really interesting advances in communities and also a process, I think, that has a lot of integrity. I know there were some folks in Detroit who came to me and said, who are the right lobbyists for us to hire to get New Market Tax Credit allocation? And I said, to ensure you don't get one, I would hire any lobbyist. What you really need to do is a consultant to write the absolutely best application, because the kiss of death is to try to game this system. And I think that's still good advice today. Tell me a little bit about that, the history of that. What do you think is its biggest strengths, and what do we need to be thinking about when we think about new markets today?
So it was kind of obvious after the success that we had had with the low-income housing tax credit to take some of those same principles and lessons and apply them to other needs. And in particular, in the realm of community development, there's a great need for economic development, whether that's manufacturing businesses or supermarkets or health clinics and charter schools. There's just a lot of need for investment in economic development in addition to affordable housing. And so we said, okay, how do we do this? And President Clinton was very open to this idea. So we started working with the Treasury Department. There had been a demonstration program enacted in 1994 that provided tax credits for 20 nonprofit community development corporations. And so I had worked on implementing that incentive, and there was some good research that we had commissioned on how that demonstration had worked out. So we took that to the Treasury Department and said, hey, there's a real opportunity here to do more. And that led to New Markets, which was really one of the very last items decided after the 2020 election, but before the inauguration of President Bush. And it was sort of one of the last items in this lame duck deal that the Congress and the outgoing President Clinton cut.
Or 2000, actually.
2000, yes.
Yes. And time flies when you're having fun.
Sorry about that.
That's okay. But tell me about how that lines up with the CDFI fund, because that's also a major Clinton administration program and has also kind of evolved. And the CDFI fund, I think, it plays a pretty important role in the new markets tax credit.
It does. So when we were looking around to figure out, well, how should new markets be implemented, we realized there was nothing like a nationwide delivery system for these kinds of activities. And so we didn't think that simply delegating that to states would work as well as it had with the low-income housing tax credit. So we decided altogether that this should be administered by the federal government. We had the good fortune of having had the CDFI fund enacted in 1994. So that was already in place, and we were able to use that as the administrating arm for the federal government. In that case, community development entities apply directly to the Treasury Department for an allocation of credit. It's a little different from low-income housing insofar as if I want low-income housing tax credits, I have a specific property and a lot of other work already done by the time I go and apply for an allocation of low-income housing credits. In the case of new markets, we knew we had to be a lot more flexible and nimble than that. And so in the case of new markets, established community development organizations go to the Treasury Department and say, here are the kinds of neighborhoods we want to work in. Here are the kinds of financing that we want to provide, whether it's loans or investments. Here's how we think we're going to raise the capital and deploy it. And then we get an amount of credits to work with, and we go find the deals to get them done.
And what next for new markets?
So I think the biggest problem with new markets is there ain't enough of it. It's a lot smaller than the low-income housing tax credits. The new markets tax credit themselves are about $2 billion a year. So that's backs up to about $5 billion of actual investment activity. When you compare that with the low-income housing credits, which are somewhere around $20 billion a year now, it's obviously a lot smaller. And what we need to do are two things. One is make the new markets credit permanent, and we need to keep expanding it. It's been a tremendous success in so many different communities, in urban and rural, that are really struggling. And that's a place-based credit rather than the low-income housing credit, which really operates in rich communities as well as poor communities.
And that rural piece, I think, is important because we are increasingly recognizing that when we think about housing and community development, we're talking about communities everywhere as opposed to the original concept, I think, which was about housing and urban development. And the needs in rural communities are distinct and significant, but they're also present different kinds of challenges than we see in some rural communities. And new markets, I think Capital Magnet Fund has a rural set aside. I think when we look at the Neighborhood Homes Investment Act, which is kind of the latest iteration of using tax credit policy to create opportunities for new housing, we see that really is vitally needed in rural communities as in any urban community. Tell me a little bit about neighborhood homes and how does that come about and where are we with that now? Because I think that's another bipartisan area that has growing appeal. And while we haven't been able to get it passed yet, a big tax bill could create that kind of opening for us.
So if you go into any lower income community, the overwhelming land use is residential. It's very hard to revitalize those communities if you're not addressing those issues, the residential property. Most of that residential property is home ownership, or rather at least single family homes. And so we needed a tool, and we still need a tool, to address those issues in those communities, urban and rural. So I'm very sensitive to the rural needs, which are often overlooked. I can't tell you how many meetings I've been in, I'm sure you've been in a few yourself, where the agenda has room for rural on it, but we don't get to it. Oh, we'll talk about that next time. And then the next meeting happens and we go through the same drill. It's so easy for it to be overlooked. And the needs are similar in some ways and distinctive in other ways. And you really have to be sensitive and respectful of those differences if you intend to be effective.
And so tell me about neighborhood homes. How does that work? And why does it work as well, potentially, I guess, as in a rural community as in an urban one?
Right. Well, it would work very similarly to the low-income housing tax credit. That is to say, it would be a capped and allocated credit that Congress would authorize, and then states would administer it the way they do with a low-income housing tax credit. They'd have a qualified allocation plan. That would be subject to public comment and review, and then potential sponsors would apply for the credits. I think here's a little wrinkle where it would look a little bit more like new markets, because our expectation would be that they'd come in and say, again, here are the neighborhoods we want to work in. Here's the kind of housing we want to build. Here's how the economics are going to work. Give us a pool of credits we can work with to be very nimble and opportunistic and pragmatic to deploy. And then capital would be raised and the homes would be built, and the credit would cover the gap between what it costs to build the housing and what the market can support. In a rural community, that's going to be a little different. We've got a lot of flexibility built into neighborhood homes to accommodate the special needs of rural communities. And what we've heard from rural communities is they see this as more than just housing. They see neighborhood homes as an economic development strategy, because it's so hard to keep growing businesses in the community and attract businesses to a community if there aren't good quality, affordable homes for workers to buy and own.
And that piece of quality is critical here, because there's often a lot of housing stock, but it's just not there in terms of quality and needs significant rehab. And that appraisal gap, the fact that it's just not going to be worth as much as it costs to repair it when you're done with those repairs, is insurmountable.
Right. It's a terrible chicken and egg problem. And so it just feeds a cycle of decline when you can't get the investment, so you can't provide quality homes. You can't provide quality homes, so the whole neighborhood deteriorates. And then it just gets harder and harder to get the work done. And we think neighborhood homes is going to reverse that cycle and make it much more of a virtuous cycle than a vicious one.
So these are about specific government programs. They have allocations, they cost money, they get implemented by the states. But we also have another way of addressing some of these community issues, which is very different, the Community Reinvestment Act. That predates a lot of this discussion going back to 1977 and has evolved over the years. But it's really more of an incentive-based system, isn't it?
Sure. Well, there's tremendous complementarity that we have seen in practice between the Community Reinvestment Act and the Low-Income Housing Credit and the New Markets Credit and other resources as well that put together these public-private partnerships. And so what the Community Reinvestment Act does in this process are really two things. One is it provides motivation for banks to make these kinds of investments. The other thing it does is it generally encourages banks to provide a wider range of capital in those communities so that those communities have the economic lifeblood they need for revitalization more broadly, and so that the communities can be a much more effective place to then make those more specific low-income housing credit or new markets credit or in the future neighborhood homes credit investments. You want to have a hospitable climate in that neighborhood for those investments. Nobody wants to be the only investor in a community. You want to be part of a thriving community where capital is flowing and people can succeed.
When we think about CRA, enacted in 1977, a very different banking system that we lived in at that time. Regulations are updated in 1995, but the banking system continues to evolve pretty dramatically. You've got interstate banking, which was really just starting to become more of a reality, taking off in a much greater velocity, much more bank consolidation. And you have technology that just didn't exist in 1977. changing the way we do banking pretty dramatically. I mean, we think about branches, we think about ATMs, but now, my mother's 93 and she makes all of her deposits on her phone, Venmos money to her grandchildren. She may be an outlier at her age, but it absolutely is the way things are going. And I don't know about you, but I haven't been inside a branch at least 10 years. And so really a pretty significant need for modernization. The Fed and OCC and FDIC have largely embraced this idea of modernizing CRA, updating the regs. That has been an effort that's been underway for arguably 10 plus years, but the last 4 or 5 years, pretty significant effort. Tell me about the need for modernization, kind of how you see this process having evolved to get us where we are today. And then I think the really big question of the day is, what the hell happened? So we'll come to what the hell happened last. How did we get here?
Well, you're absolutely right about the changes in the industry. There also have been great changes in the practice of affordable housing and community development and small business finance and the consumer face for banks. Everything has changed. Big shock. 1995 was a long time ago. Before 1995, I should just mention, yes, CRA had been in place since 1977, but the focus had really been very much on process. Like, had banks been talking to community organizations? Did they ever talk to their board about community reinvestment issues? Not a lot of focus on actual production or impact. So 1995 said, we're going to have a performance-based regulation for community reinvestment. And that was really fundamental to expanding capital and shoring up communities.
Well, let me ask you about that performance-based measurement, the performance context, as we call it. Is that in the statute?
Statute goes back, as we said, to 1977, when Congress wrote legislation a lot more generally and briefly, I might add, than has been the case in the last generation. You look at that statute and you say, well, it's really very directional, very broad, and gives a wide range of administrative authorities. There are some things that are kind of specified in there because, this was written at a time, as you say, before we had interstate banking, and some of the impetus came from places like Chicago. At the time, banks could only have a single branch in Illinois. So it's a really different time. So what the agencies have been trying to do is to modernize CRA so that it is much more responsive to community needs and accommodates changes in the banking system as well.
So the regulators ultimately, through a whole range of ups and downs and shifts and changes and pendulum swings, we can go down that rabbit hole for about an hour and a half and then come back to this, but we'll decide not to do that. They put out a final rule, and I think you and I in particular had a lot of input in that process. The rule comes out, and what happens? Because the more people look at this very complicated the rule, the more people start saying, well, what about this or what about that? And then the banks end up filing a lawsuit, which risks throwing the whole thing out. And they've got a judge that's very aligned with a broader assault on what they call the administrative state. I think it's fair to say that chances are that this reg is going to get thrown out by that judge, that the appeals court that's aligned with that judge is going to end up upholding him, and whether it goes to the Supreme Court or not, we could be back to the drawing board. What happened? How did we end up, after all of this consultation and all of this work together, end up basically risking starting from scratch?
I don't want to assign this responsibility to all banks, because I think there are quite a number of banks that were quite satisfied with the final rule, and others that, while they may have had some misgivings, common in any kind of complex rulemaking outcome, would not have chosen to sue over it.
And that's how I pretty much saw my members laying out. Some of the banks thought they worked out good enough. Some of them were like, well, it's not what I would have done, but I can work with this. And if few were pretty unhappy. Now here we are.
No, I think the main sticking point for those banks and their associations that did decide to go forward with the lawsuit was the question of whether and how banks should be accountable in any way for home mortgage and small business lending outside of their branch footprints. Mm-hmm. So, many banks make loans on a nationwide basis or regional basis well beyond where they have their branches. And traditionally, CRA has focused on the communities surrounding branches of banks. As you say, the industry is changing, and so much more of the banking industry is now operating virtually. I think the last time I checked, virtual banks, by which I mean banks with really no or virtually no branches at all, had over $1.5 trillion in assets. And so the question is, well, if you don't have any branches, how are you supposed to be accountable under CRA? So the agencies said, well, wherever it is that you are making a significant number of loans, then we're going to factor performance on those loans as well as performance in the more traditional branch-based areas. And that was just something that some banks didn't want to accept, and so they sued.
And now we're in a place where actually the legal environment is even more challenging because the Supreme Court has thrown out this concept of what's referred to as Chevron deference. And since the 1980s, the courts have said, we're going to give a lot of deference to regulatory agencies about what the statute means, and then before the courts really weigh in. What the Roberts Court has said now is, yeah, no, it's not going to work like that. This concept is really accommodating Congress's failure to act and make these kinds of judgments, which is what they should be doing. And that's just not good enough. Congress needs to change the law if the law needs to be changed. We're not going to give deference to the agencies. How that's going to play out, I think we're going to have to see as things roll out. But certainly when it comes to CRA and a statute that is as simple and as brief as the CRA statute is, and other statutes that are similar, this could really be a game changer, couldn't it?
Well, not just here, but I think across the regulatory waterfront. And basically, as you say, the courts have said, we think the people in the agencies that live and breathe these issues every day are not as well positioned to sort them out as we at the Supreme Court are, is really a breathtaking power grab. I don't think there's any other way to interpret it. And I think in the case of CRA, it'll be interesting to see, probably less at the district court level for the reason you suggested, but a little bit more at the circuit court level, how sweeping a ruling might be. It would be very easy, for example, for a court to say, oh, we see what the banking industry is objecting to here, and we're going to agree with them on those things. And so those elements, which are fairly circumscribed within the CRA context, we're going to throw those out, but we're going to leave the rest of the rule in place. And that would follow a very broadly recognized principle of severability, that you don't necessarily have to throw out the entire law if only a slice of the law is found to be in violation of constitutional principles.
You don't have to, but
they could.
And so what's the right move for regulators right now? Should they let this play out and see how the chips fall? Or would your call be, let's just withdraw this rule and start over?
So I think there are a couple ways to go. Number one is we haven't seen what's going to happen in the courts, whether the courts will throw out the entire rule or just portions of it. Were that to happen, we'd revert to the current rule.
Mm-hmm.
So in a way, CRA would just continue unless the current rule were now challenged, in which case we'd go through a whole other court process on that.
Could the judge just throw out everything, including the 95 changes?
I think that would be far in excess of the case before them today, but one never assumes anything.
No, we're definitely in some uncharted waters here.
Uncertainty is not good for business. I would say, though. And the disruption isn't really going to do anybody any favors.
So now what for Buzz Roberts? It's amazing career, incredible depth of knowledge and perspective. What's the future look like? I don't see you sitting in a rocking chair.
Well,
maybe a little bit, but not much.
I've got a great rocking chair.
You might, yeah.
Well, I'm on the board of a wonderful nonprofit housing developer here in the Washington, D.C. area. It's called the Arlington Partnership for Affordable Housing, but we work in many jurisdictions beyond Arlington. And it's a very accomplished, creative, and ambitious organization. So I'm really happy to be part of that. I'll be joining the board of another major nonprofit developer starting next year. And I've got a couple of other things in the works, but I don't really plan to do a lot of writing. Don't plan to be spending a lot of time on the Hill or performing administrative responsibilities at a trade association. I do hope that it'll be a much easier next 10 years.
One of the things I always ask people who come on the show is about the bigger you, the most interesting and important fact about you that has nothing to do about your work with other people just might not be aware of. What's the kind of most interesting thing about Buzz Roberts that does not include the word housing in the sentence?
I don't think I'm that interesting, but let's see. Well, now that I've retired from softball, can't do that. But I really am looking forward to doing a lot of traveling. My wife and I just spent a month in Paris. Next spring, I'm planning to spend 3 weeks in India and Nepal. And so I'm really looking forward to getting to be a lot more interesting than I've been.
Well, I'm on my way to India next week, and we were in Paris the month before you went to Paris. So I think we are.
You're the scouting team.
I appear to be your scout advance team. Tell me a little bit about Paris. What was that? I mean, you were there a month. You rented an apartment, not the tourist experience.
The best thing about that really was not feeling pressured to squeeze in every last museum in a couple of days available in Paris. And just to be able to go out every morning to the boulangerie and pick up croissants, and then you don't shop for your evening baguette in the morning. You go back in the evening to get your dinner baguette. And it was just sort of leaning into that pace and really being part of a neighborhood where the people at the corner store, the people in the local restaurants, that was really, I think, the best of it.
Yeah, it's a great city and it's a great place to live because of the lifestyle. It is not an American lifestyle, not what we're used to. Maybe our great-grandparents lived like that, but certainly our life here is so much more efficient, but loses something in the process. And having that experience, in our case, just for a week, to be able to just get up in the morning and say, well, what do you want to do today? The very non-tourist experience. It's a nice way to travel. It's a nice way to see the world.
You can do it for a week if you've got a busy day job.
Or you can do it for a month.
Or you can do it for a month if you're retired.
There you have it. Or longer. Well, it sounds like it's good to be Buzz Roberts.
I've always considered myself an extremely lucky guy.
We'll have to make a bumper sticker. It's good to be Buzz. On that note, thank you so much for joining us. Always a pleasure.
Well, David, you're one of the finest professionals and finest humans in our field. And so it's a pleasure and honor to be with you, as always.
That's very high praise. I've learned not to explain to you why you may be mistaken, but just to say thank you. So thank you. Thank you for listening to this edition of Beyond Four Walls. You can visit the National Housing Conference at nhc.org. There you can learn more about affordable housing policies, affordability challenges throughout the nation on our Paycheck to Paycheck database, and explore membership in NHC for you or your organization. We appreciate your interest and look forward to working with you in the future. Until next time, I'm David Dworkin, NHC's President and CEO, wishing you a great day.